across our country. Most of all, I want to thank the American people. To serve as your president has been an honor beyond description. Thank you.
Welcome to the South Asian Environment Dialogue. All of you know that this is a program where we discuss range of issues regarding climate change, environment in this part of the world. And this is a very, very important part of the world with a huge, huge population and resources as well. And in the last 4 months or so, we have been discussing several issues. But today, the discussion topics is, I think, enormously important. That is vanishing groundwater with a question mark. I have a fabulous panel to discuss this. We all know that how the groundwater is being used or abused in this part of the world, also the rest of the world as well. And I think a fabulous panel. Let me introduce the panel to all of you. Before that, let me tell you as well that this is a program, as you know, is brought on by the Climate Channel, which is a Canadian television channel in collaboration with the Plural media platform from India and notvbangla YouTube channel from Bangladesh. So that's the structure. And let me introduce the panel to all of you. For today's program, I have with me Dr. Professor Abhijit Mukherjee. He's a professor at the Department of Geology and the School of Environmental Sciences, IIT Kharagpur. Welcome, Abhijit, to the show.
Hello. Hello.
It's really a pleasure to have you. And I know you are a busy person. To kind of have you is something. I thank you for being part of the program. I have with me Dr. Asif Javed, a senior assistant professor from the Bahria University, Islamabad, Pakistan. He's from the Department of Art and Environmental Sciences. Welcome, Professor Javed, to the program. And it's an absolute pleasure to host you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Basu.
I have with me Dr. Kazi, Matin, Ahmed, a very, very senior professor, and I'm told one of the senior pros in groundwater in the entire region. He's a professor with the Dhaka University, and as I said, a senior pro in the region. Welcome, Professor Javed, Professor Matin, to the show. It's absolutely fantastic to have you in the program.
Thank you very much, Jayanta, for your kind words. Thank you for inviting me.
And I have with me Dr. Aditi Mukherjee. He's the principal researcher, International Water Management Institute, IWMI, and I know her, I think, over a long time, and she has been working in the entire region, not only in India, but entire South Asian region on the policy perspective and other related issues. I think you'll be adding a very, very important input to the whole program. Welcome, Aditi, to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not the least, I think somebody who can have a bird's eye view from outside the region. We are all from the region, but we all sometimes need somebody from the outside the region to kind of tickle the boxes and say these boxes are not being tickled. Professor David Polya from University of Manchester, Faculty of Science and Engineering, and has a wealth of experience on groundwater. So welcome to the show, Professor Polya.
Well, thank you very much, Jayanta, for inviting us. And yes, I'm very, very happy to provide an external perspective. And I think also to learn from all the experts that you have here that are actually from out South Asia.
I think in the coming 1 hour or so, I think all of us can talk together to not only to know the problems, but perhaps also to find out a roadmap of solution if there is any. So with this perspective, let me introduce, I know that all of you will be providing those figures, but just a few pointers. South Asian region use half of the global groundwater for irrigation. Whatever being used all over the world, the South Asian countries use half of the world global groundwater for irrigation. There are about 20 million wells across South Asian countries, 20 million wells. And vital aquifers are depleting. And there is issue of various issues, social issues, political issues. Also the issue of electricity subsidy, which mostly work in India. That's also a kind of a bit of a bone of contention in some cases. So that's some initial pointers just to make people understand how enormous the issue and problem of kind of groundwater is. Let me start with Abhijit. Abhijit, you have been working with this agenda for quite some time. Let us know that what is the reality of groundwater right now in this part of the world, Abhijit?
Thank you very much, Jayanta. It's a pleasure to put my comments in. So at present, what I can say, the South Asia is the largest consumer of groundwater resources in the world, not only in present times, but in the human history. So no times in the past have any country other than the South Asian countries have used up that much groundwater from the subsurface. Now, as you would know, like groundwater is partly renewable, but much of it is non-renewable. So we are actually using a resource which is never going to come back. It's gone and gone forever. At the same time, as we are using a huge amount of groundwater resource, the South Asian countries host also the regions which are some of the most polluted in terms of groundwater regions of the world. So we have regions which have huge arsenic problem in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. We have fluoride problem, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and many other geogenic pollutants as well as anthropogenic pollutants. So if you take together, the South Asian countries are going through a crisis, I would say a crisis, that the world has never seen before in a natural terms. So I suppose, one of the tasks that lies over in front of us is not only to study the resources, but also to manage it so that we can sustain this very valuable resource for our future generation.
Okay. Abhijit, just a quick supplementary, say about say a 30-year scale, 3-decade scale or 4-decade scale. I'm saying 3 or 4 decade because I think the world has changed in the last 30, 40 years with the consumerism and everything playing their role. How do you see the paradigm of groundwater in this region? Has it been consistently going down or it has been sped up in the last decade or so? What's the kind of general paradigm?
See, the groundwater resource started getting mostly used, since the kind of the green revolution started in the South Asian region, which is back 1960s, early 70s. So since then, because of the policy shift and food production, need for food production, groundwater is getting used. And it's around the same time, like when groundwater started getting used for drinking water purposes. Before that, it was mostly surface water. So from about late 60s, early 70s, groundwater mining started, if I may use the word mining. And since then, groundwater is mostly used, 85% of or more of it is used mostly for food production. It's not actually for drinking or domestic purposes or industrial purposes like many other countries. So it's actually more than the water, it's the food that, we are also concerned about. So it's not only we are going to go through a stress for water, but we are also going through a stress of food if we are looking in the future.
Okay. Before I come to individual countries and kind of take the response of the scenario in the respective countries, let me go to Professor Polya again. Polya, because of the fact that Abhijit has opened up the entire South Asian region. Professor Polya, what do you feel about it? I don't need to repeat the question. What according to you, is the scenario in South Asia on groundwater, and how it has been kind of went all the last few decades? Professor Polya.
Well, first of all, I would agree with what Abhijit has been saying. India is, by far the largest country that is utilizing finite groundwater resources, and across the whole of South Asia, it is a massive issue. But it's worth saying, I think, a couple of things. One is, this is a global problem. China, Brazil, other countries have the same kind of issues, not necessarily at the same scale, but they have the same kinds of issues. So in terms of solutions, I think India has a lot to contribute, not just to solving its own problems, but also to contributing to solutions in other countries.
Okay, and you feel that groundwater has been consistently going down over the last few decades, or it has been sped up? The depletion has been sped up in the last kind of recent time. What's your take on that?
I think others, particularly Abhijit, is probably better able to speak about the detail of this in India. My understanding, in some places, policies on groundwater management have actually helped groundwater levels to recover. But there are kind of mega trends in terms of drivers. The mega trends are population increase, increased wealth, which leads to increased demand for consumption of foods, which might require large amounts of water. And they're two megatrends that, whatever solutions are come up with, it needs to accommodate those two megatrends.
Okay, I think we'll be discussing all these issues this evening. But before that, let me go to Professor Matin from Bangladesh. What is the scenario, Professor Matin, in Bangladesh, and also your experience in maybe other parts of South Asia, very quickly, Professor Matin?
Okay, thank you. What Abhijit said is something very serious that we'll have to be careful about the future sustainability. But at the same time, the role that groundwater has been playing in socioeconomic development, in providing public health, safe water access, food security are extremely important. And if for some reason the sustainability is not maintained, then we'll have very big problems in the coming days. So let me highlight the current groundwater uses in Bangladesh first. We all know Bangladesh is a country of river, but because of unavailability of water during the dry season, our reliance on groundwater is extremely high. Say, for example, rural people, almost 100% people rely on groundwater for drinking. And also in the urban areas, it's not that much different. All the major cities, small towns, always water supply is dependent on groundwater. Coming to the agricultural sector, again, this is heavily dependent on groundwater. Current irrigation coverage, more than 70% comes from groundwater. And industrialization is picking up in Bangladesh. Urbanization is picking up in Bangladesh. And all the sectors, again, are dependent on groundwater heavily. So starting from for drinking purpose, it started immediately after independence. Like after 70s, the large-scale groundwater use for drinking purpose sector started. But the impact that we see today, it started in the mid-80s. I would say the 85 onwards, when this irrigation started heavily. And then from the 2000 onwards, starting from the starting of the century, we can see the impacts of urbanization and industrialization. So groundwater is depleting. And on top of that, there are issues of quality, geogenic contamination, like arsenic is a big problem.
We'll be talking about the quality. We'll be talking about the quality separately, because I think that's a very, very important part. You are just mentioning about the quality. But let me kind of quickly know the views of the other kind of panelists before I come to the next set of questions. Let me go to Dr. Aditi Mukherjee. Dr. Mukherjee, you have been working with not only in India, but I think you have worked a lot in Nepal as well and other parts of South Asia. What's your take? Is that we consider, and you mainly work in the policy sector. So what's your take that groundwater is something being taken for granted? There's no structured policy or something of that. We can discuss the policy, but the situation-wise, I'm talking about both the quantity and quality-wise. The concern that you groundwater experts have been voicing over the years, do it get reflected in the policy and politics of the region?
I think that's a very important question, and perhaps it wasn't so apparent. Like, even in the 90s and the early 2000s, when Green Revolution was already into 30, 40 years, people still had the misconception that Green Revolution was supported by canal irrigation, which was far from truth, because Green Revolution was entirely supported by groundwater. So that kind of misunderstandings were there. But in the last 20 years, I have seen a huge amount of awareness about groundwater. And the most important thing is, I think we have to address the elephant in the room. Groundwater exploitation is a direct result of our food policy. Our food policy of providing cheap food to the non-growing population, which is non-food growing population, which is very, very large. So as long as we remain addicted to the cheap food that we have all got used to, rice and wheat, and that kind of high water consuming food, I mean, there is no other way but for us to use groundwater. And it has played a tremendous role in food security. So while it's important to acknowledge there is an issue of overexploitation, but let us not forget that Professor Matin was rightly saying the very fact that Bangladesh, with a very small landholding, is food secure since the late 90s. Nothing but, being able to grow crops 3 times a year is what makes Bangladesh grow the food. What makes India grow the food. So groundwater provides food security. It provides a lot of employment opportunities, poverty alleviation. So let's not forget all those positives that has come. And that's why the overexploitation problem is even more scary. We are not only looking at quote unquote vanishing groundwater, but with it, we could be also looking at vanishing food security. So let's situate the debate within the larger macroeconomic water, energy, food nexus kind of issues.
But Aditi, just kind of take on with that. I have seen both in India and Bangladesh that people are extracting groundwater within 100 meters of a river. That's a very common scene if you go to Bangladesh or if you come to the kind of northern part of West Bengal. So I always have a question in my mind, which I thought about sharing with you, and maybe I'll take a response, that is the overexploitation of groundwater is actually a failure of utilizing optimum surface water. So that's something I think very important to understand. But before that, I'll come to that question. But before that, let me go over to Professor Javed. Professor Javed, we have all been discussing about the use of groundwater. Just now, Aditi was talking about it. In Pakistan, I believe, what the data I have, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is 90% of your agriculture, 90% of your irrigation depends solely on groundwater.
Yes, it almost varies, like for 75 to 85% in most of the reports. It has been reported that 75 to 85% of the irrigation has been done through the groundwater. And it's after the Green Revolution. I would just second the Aditi Mukherjee, who clearly said that the Green Revolution is basically not the introduction of canal system. It is actually the installation of different private wells by the owners, by the rich people in the region. Let's say, if I can quote you the example of Pakistan, we have like 1.2 million private tube wells in the region, which can extract like 60
Sorry to interrupt you. These private wells are being allowed by the government formally, yes, or these are illegal wells?
No, these are not. They are allowed actually. Basically, they are not illegal. There are 2 types of wells. One are installed by the government of Pakistan, and then are the private small wells that can extract the water. They are diesel operated, or they are like electricity operated wells. So there are a lot of wells, and they can extract like more water. So what happens in Pakistan? Basically, there are 2 problems that exist with the groundwater. One is the quality, and another is the quantity. After the Indus Basin replacement work, we have a large network of canals that can supply water to different area. So what happens is the problem of waterlogging and salinity arise in Pakistan, which has badly affected the country. Like more than 50% of land was severely sodic and saline with the introduction of these canals and all those systems. And then Pakistan Water and Power Development Authority had to initiate 66 CAR projects. That is salinity control and reclamation project. That was a big issue. Even now, with the hectic efforts, we have now 21% or 25% areas still affected by waterlogging and salinity, which can severely affect the, you can say the crop growth. And yes, I will also second the Aditi who said that there's some positive too, but the problem is rich farmer can afford the private tube well. Obviously, it results more intensification in the crops. But when I said, if we are irrigating a rice crop with a tube well or groundwater, so we are not actually selling the rice, we are selling our water basically. And if you know, obviously you have come across that Pakistan has now been clearly declared as a water scared country. So because our irrigation canal water is hardly can manage to reach 27% of area. That's not sufficient.
Absolutely. Okay, I think very, very interesting pointers being raised in the first round of kind of interaction. Let me go back to Abhijit again. Abhijit, two things. One is about we talked about the quantity part of it, mostly in the, so far we have, whatever we have discussed. But I think quality is also a lot under scanner. And when we talk about the quality, also the policy perspectives are coming to the picture. For example, when this so-called Green Revolution happened in Punjab, state of Punjab, and around in India, it was considered the thing. But now many experts feel that the Green Revolution and the amount of water being extracted has actually catered to something not very comfortable in the present scenario. So what, Abhijit, your take on that? The quantity we have talked, but what is the quality of water and the kind of situation that we are in? Abhijit.
So like when we are talking about quality, there are two sources of issues where the quality can get polluted. The first one is the geogenic, which is the natural pollution, which is with linked to the Mother Earth itself. And in the subcontinent and South Asia, there are major geogenic pollutants, like I said, like arsenic, fluoride, salinity to a certain extent. Also nowadays, uranium and other emerging geogenic pollutants. At the same time, South Asia being the home of one of the largest population in the world and densest population of the world, we are also using a lot of pesticides, PHAs, and other organic products, which are actually more poisonous in some sense than the geogenic pollutants.
Absolutely.
And they cannot be even remediated. That's the other problem with it. And although they are more focused and they are more local than the geogenic pollutants, but they are also getting introduced. Now, as you said, that like when you started the Green Revolution in the 70s. Now, before that, if you look at the history of drinking water usage in the South Asia, and this is from the colonial periods, like the British, like in the pre-colonial time, they did understand that the recurrent epidemics that used to happen in South Asia, mostly in the northern Indian provinces, that was linked with the surface water quality, because surface water was the dominant drinking water source in those days. And slowly, as India got independent, Pakistan got independent, Bangladesh eventually got independent, the drinking water source slowly changed to groundwater with the expectation that groundwater is naturally purifying the water, and you will have less microbial polluted water. And that was the main, the trigger.
Switch over trigger.
Yeah. But what it ended up, and as we discovered in India back in 1978, and subsequently in Bangladesh 1993, if I recall, that a major part of this groundwater has natural pollution. Now, you cannot do much about this natural pollution because it's there because the water is there and the rocks are there, okay? So, of course, the Green Revolution has destroyed whatever natural equilibrium was there. But again, I would reiterate that the geogenic pollution is natural, and the Green Revolution possibly accelerated the spreading of the pollutants, but it didn't start it. But the industrialization certainly did.
Okay, I think very fascinating. Let bring Professor Polya into the discussion here. That from outside, because sometimes when we talk about issues like green revolution, we tend to get biased sometimes because these are also being catered to huge socioeconomic changes. So it's not really very easy to kind of say black or white. It's something a gray area. So Professor Polya, when you are seeing from outside at a macro scale, how do you feel that this kind of whatever we have done through green revolution and the quality of groundwater, what's your take on that?
Well, I think this might be in an American expression, motherhood and apple pie. They're things, you can't argue that either of those two things are anything other than good. And I suspect that during the Green Revolution, those who were suggesting that we should have massive irrigation based on groundwater, they had the best possible motives. And it was very difficult to argue with an argument that basically also says for drinking water, your surface waters are contaminated. There are lots of pathogens in them. So the obvious answer is to go to groundwater. I mean, who would argue with that? But actually, scientifically, the basis for that is very poor indeed, very poor indeed. There have been studies from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, for example, that certainly a few years ago, there were no demonstrable studies that showed that transferring drinking water to groundwater as opposed to surface water actually improves people's health, because there are lots of other things going on at the same time that are incredibly important. For example, improved living standards, education, and particularly education of women. That's probably been one of the most fundamental drivers to, the improved life in many areas. So I think from an external point of view, I would say actually we as external people are very much part of initiating this problem as well. And it says an awful lot for having a community of people within country that is able to stand up and say, well, actually, I appreciate this might work well for you in the UK or America or wherever, but actually in our context, whether it be Bangladesh or India or Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, whichever one, this is our local context and this is what's going to work best for us.
Very, very, I think absolutely apt. But one thing it often crosses my mind that when we have, as Abhijit was pointing out, when we have switched over to surface water to groundwater, the trigger was that groundwater would be much less polluted. So the quality was the trigger behind switchover, so-called switchover from surface to groundwater. But now we are talking about the groundwater being polluted. This is ironical. So how do you take that?
Well, it's true. I mean, just because you don't see something doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And one key thing for me, wherever we are in the world, one key issue about this is transparency. I think I think you were mentioning like canals versus groundwater. People say, oh, we're getting the water from canals, not from groundwater. Maybe the reason people say that is because they can see canals, but they can't see under the ground.
Exactly.
And possibly the same is true of arsenic as well. There are some visible manifestations of arsenicosis, of, skin hardening and skin coloration, hyperpigmentation. But actually the most serious long-term health effects of arsenic poisoning from groundwater are things that people don't necessarily associate. They're cancers, which are very long latency period. So, maybe people lack the connection, just as, 60 years ago, people didn't make the connection necessarily between smoking and cancer. The same with groundwater and cancer. And the other really big one is cardiovascular disease.
I think absolutely. On that note, to Aditi, let me kind of complete this round on this so-called green revolution and the impact. Aditi, all said and done, green revolution has also catapulted India to be a sovereign country in terms of agriculture at one point of time. And this trend is still continuing. So really can't blame squarely on that. As a policy analyst, as a policy researchers, how do you see this? We know that when you are doing this green revolution, extracting water, maybe unlimited water, you are creating trouble. You are asking for trouble. But at the same time, that water being used in agriculture, that water is used for those purposes. how you see that as a policy part.
The way I see it is that, first of all, I would like to step a bit back and say that we cannot paint South Asia with the same brush, groundwater in South Asia with the same brush, because South Asia is a really big region. I mean, and then we have very distinct typologies, both hydrologically as well as policy-wise. So there would be, like, with a very broad, rough cut kind of a thing would be, we have these typologies of, say, northwestern parts, which would include Indian Punjab, Haryana, Pakistan, Punjab. These are the places with alluvial aquifers, but with very little rainfall. So natural recharge is low. And those areas had free electricity, not necessarily Pakistan, Punjab, they had a bit different policies, but those areas had those really high incentive for over extracting groundwater. On the other hand, you have these eastern parts, and you mentioned Nepal a little bit ago. So Nepal, Tarai, this all of eastern India, Bihar plains, and Uttar Pradesh, and even large chunks of Bangladesh. These are the places, again, with alluvial aquifer, but with very high rainfall, 1000 millimeter, 1500 millimeter, with very high natural recharge. So here the equation is quite different. In these parts, actually, quite perversely, green revolution came much later, and it came depending not so much on electric and free electricity, but farmers have been using diesel pumps, which are much more expensive. So we have a huge paradox in South Asia, that we have farmers in Punjab and Haryana who pump water from 100 feet, 150 feet, even 300 feet, but it cost almost them nothing, because electricity is more or less free. While you have farmers in Bangladesh or in Eastern India or in Nepal, Tarai, who are pumping water from only 10 or 20 feet, but they are paying much high because they are using diesel pumps. So I think we need to keep into account what I call a very political ecology kind of a perspective on groundwater, and not try and paint it on a similar basis. And when it comes to pollution, I feel I completely agree with Abhijit's points about the geogenic pollution with arsenic, and I feel Bangladesh, and Professor Matin and can certainly add. So this, like, arsenic is there, and we have to kind of live with it and grow crops still. We cannot stop growing crops. So I really like some of the things that Bangladesh has done in terms of, developing arsenic resistant crops and doing better farm water management, like system of rice intensification. The idea being put less water that doesn't take up. So there are those remedial ways, and we have to, I keep, maybe because I'm a policy researcher, I kind of look at things from a political economy angle, and I have huge reservations in painting South Asia with the same brush. Water's not vanishing everywhere, certainly. Yeah.
No, and that's fair, absolutely fair. No qualms on that. But again, you said that, so for example, West Bengal, major parts of West Bengal are pretty well rain-fed. Now I'm talking about South Bengal, Southwest Bengal. There are reasonably good rain, but I know some of the areas in Southwest Bengal are being identified as the groundwater deficient, despite having the rainfall. So the agenda and issue of proper groundwater management is, I think, extremely important. Yes. So that has to be there, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And that's where you can do a number of things, like some of the things like water harvesting in the pre-monsoon. The thing is that even though these parts have quite a large amount of rainfall, it's not necessarily we are recharging them all very well. And one of the better effective ways of recharge, and again, I think Abhijit and others can point out, is there has been this entire thesis around Ganges water machine. Emptying the top part of the aquifer actually might lead to a little, more water seeping in. So in that perspective, perhaps boro paddy wasn't such a bad idea. And we have to also corroborate that with more rainwater harvesting during the monsoon season. The point is our rainfall is enough, but all our surface water bodies dry up by the time.
Rainfall, yeah. And with this changing climate, how the rainfall is being kind of playing its role, we need to discuss. But let me first come to Professor Matin and then to Professor Javed. Same question, quality and arsenic being repeatedly being referred by, I think Abhijit referred it, Professor Polya and also Aditi referred it. Professor Matin, what's your take on the quality of groundwater in Bangladesh in general?
Right. Yeah, one thing that's very important is shifting from surface water to groundwater had enormous impact on public health. Like if you talk about under 5 child mortality and other things, this has decreased. I agree with Dave, there are other issues involved in it, but there are clear, you can see the outcomes. like our average age has increased significantly, and under 5, this is mostly because of under 5 child mortality. And also the food security, it is very important. And the issue that we find today, I'm coming to the quality issue next, like is overuse in use of groundwater in irrigation. I think that is mostly linked to the management issues. Yeah. But we cannot think of a situation that we don't use groundwater for irrigation. We cannot use groundwater for drinking purpose. So we have to prioritize what comes first. So policies are very important. So let me move on to the quality issue. Yes, I fully agree that the initial intention was just looking into bacterial safe water. So at that time, there were these arsenic or other chemical contaminants were not looked after. That is a mistake that was done at the time, but I would say this is an inadvertent mistake. It was not done intentionally. And introduction of groundwater was done with good intention that it would save millions of lives from diarrheal disease and other issues.
Okay.
So now that even today, what we see in Bangladesh, initially, when we started, Abhijit rightly pointed out that it was first officially detected in 1993. And since then, there has been a number of studies. So there has been a number of screening. So initially, one thing that I would like to point out here, we are still sticking to that 50 ppb limit, which has changed in many parts of the world. But in Bangladesh, we are still sticking to that 50 ppb limit. So considering that, still, as of the last survey of 2019, that still about 18 million people are drinking above that limit. So this is a big number still today, but it has come down from 30 million in 1999 or 98 to, it's going down despite the population is going up.
Okay. So what about salinity, Professor Matin? I think salinity is also a big issue in Bangladesh.
That salinity is mainly an issue in the coastal area, but over most of the coastal area, we are lucky that we have good deep groundwater. But there are some parts of the coastal belt where we don't have fresh groundwater, and that part we have real water scarcity. So over most of the coastal area, we have good quality deep groundwater. Let me finish with 1 point or 2 points on is manganese. So this is coming again in discussion. So we have occurrence of manganese over most of the country. I think also in West Bengal, we have high manganese occurrences. And microbiological contamination, initially we thought groundwater will be totally safe from microbiological contamination. That is not entirely true.
So there is microbiological contamination in the groundwater itself?
Oh, yeah.
I'm coming to that. And this is mostly because of anthropogenic activities. So what we are doing, we are trying to improve sanitation. We are using extensively pit latrines and other things. So we are introducing microbes into the atmosphere. So those are there. So there are issues,
there are sources. There are manganese. There is. Okay. Professor Javed, what's your take? I think arsenic is also an issue, and there are other quality issue in Pakistan as well.
Yes. We actually have recently completed one project with India, and we have tested more than 30,000 wells. And out of which, if I said like 25% of the wells were contaminated with arsenic, or you can say like it contains more than 10 microgram per liter of arsenic in it, which is the WHO guideline. And 15 microgram per liter is the Pakistani guideline for arsenic. But before discussing the arsenic,
just hold. What's the arsenic guideline in Pakistan?
It's a 50 microgram per liter, just like a Bangladesh, as Kazi mentioned.
Just sorry to interrupt you. I think India has gone to the WHO, no, isn't it? Aditi, what's India's arsenic
India officially
guideline?
Also 50, but they refer to or recommend 10. So it's a kind of a duplicacy.
So it means that South Asian countries do not have a uniform guideline for identifying arsenic.
No, it's 50.
I think it's 50 everywhere.
But India has now gone to the WHO guideline, isn't it?
10. It's recommended.
Recommended, okay.
So Bureau of Indian Standards.
Play with the words,
10.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, sorry, Professor Javed. I just tried to understand the
problem is, I'll continue from 1960s when the Green Revolution came in. What happened actually, if you look at the actual quality of groundwater, original native quality of groundwater is basically saline because of the marine origin of the this area, Punjab and all those South Asian region. So what happened with the introduction of irrigation? Extensive canals are built, which introduces a good quality water into the groundwater. So there are fresh groundwater lenses are formed near the canals and near the rivers. Freshwater ground lenses, which is saline free. But what is happening actually, I was referring to arsenic. What's the problem here, man? The problem is arsenic is high near the floodplains, particularly Ravi floodplains. Ravi is the river. It's no more a river. It's under the India control. So we have very less water in that Ravi river. So if you just measure the groundwater near the Ravi river, it contains high amount of arsenic near the Ravi river compared to the Chenab, Jhelum, and other rivers. And if you go away from the river, what happens is arsenic concentration get down, it's get lower, but at the same time, salinity problem arise. So it's the kind of problem. We have a farmer is basically confused which type of water is to use, because if farmer is using a water that is near to the floodplain, it contains high amount of arsenic in Ravi floodplain. But if it go away from the floodplain, so he came across the problem of salinity. This is the major problem in Pakistan and Rafsar region. And second thing, in addition to Abhijit Mukherjee, as I mentioned earlier, the renewability time of groundwater is very high. It's like it takes about 1400 years on average to renew, depend upon the properties of aquifer and all those things. But it can renew in 1400 years. Whereas if we rely on the surface water, it can renew within a period of 7 to 15 days. So if we keep polluting our groundwater, and as Kazi Matin mentioned, the small problems also exist, like microbial contamination in the shallow aquifer. That's more pronounced in Pakistan.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you, because we have to kind of do other 2-3 very important questions to all of you. But as I understand broadly, the problems, I'm coming to Abhijit, I'm coming. Broadly, the problems of groundwater are generally not very, I would say, absolutely homogeneous, but there's a broad pattern to it in the South Asian countries, which I feel is a real case for the interfraternity of researchers, experts, and perhaps the governance to work together to a regional solution. I'll come to that, but before that, Abhijit, you would like to say something on that?
Like just two very specific points. Like when we are talking about groundwater, we were talking about the rivers, but mostly as like a predecessor to groundwater.
Yes.
Now, one of the things that we need to also understand that the rivers are actually surviving, all the rivers, they are surviving on groundwater.
Exactly.
And as we are taking out the groundwater, the rivers are actually drying out. Yeah. And this is not, I'm talking about the perennial rivers of South India, like where, there is no glacier or much rainfall. It's also mega rivers like Ganga, the Indus, the Brahmaputra. They are drying out. Believe me. By 2050, if we don't take action now, Ganga is going to dry out. Major reaches of the southern part of Ganga.
So you're talking about the base flow. You're talking about the base flow.
Yes, absolutely.
So you're saying that by 2050, Ganga may dry up if we don't kind of stop the excessive extraction of groundwater? That's what you're saying?
Absolutely, I'm saying that. Absolutely.
I think very, very critical. Anybody want to make a comment on this? Anyone like to just on this particular point on the Ganges? Ganges is a lifeline, 2,500 kilometer. And I think if I'm not wrong, then 1 out of every 12 person in this world live at the Ganga basin. I don't say Ganga, but the Ganga basin. So we could jolly well understand the impact of it. Anybody want to just kind of be on table on this? That what Abhijit just said, that Ganga will be drying out by 2050. Professor Polya, you would like to add something very quickly?
Well, I'll just be very uncontroversial and just say that what the Mukherjee's proposed is incredibly plausible. It needs to be quantified, but if I was living in the Ganga River Basin and responsible for water management, this would be one of the major things that I think concerned about.
Very, 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 very important. Thank you, Abhijit, for raising a very critical point. Yes, Aditi.
My point was, I don't have anything to contribute to Ganga drying or not, because I also do think with climate change, the rainfall would likely to, yes, rainfall is likely to intensify. I would worry right now more about Indus because of Indus's high dependence on glaciers, and that's kind of almost certain that even in
so according to you,
glaciers,
as per the risks kind of priority, Indus comes one and then Ganges comes.
Yes, I would put Indus above Ganges because of the overwhelming dependence on glaciers, and glaciers are the first victims of climate change. They're almost like climate change markers. But there's a point of Abhijit that I want to underline. For far too long in South Asia, we have siloed groundwater and surface water as if those are two separate pots of water. They are not. They are the same pot, right? So I think we have to get control back our narrative and kind of talk of water as one water, not like surface water, groundwater, because I mean the rivers are receiving...
Not a Ganga ministry and a water ministry in isolation. You said that there should be one water ministry.
Yes.
One water governance.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Because these are connected.
As you raised, Aditi, the issue of climate change, I'm actually coming to that. And I have 15 minutes and 3 set of questions. One is the climate change, one is the politics, and last the solution. So be kind of adapt to that. It's all the age of adaptation. So you need to adapt to that time. So let me start with perhaps Professor Matin. The climate change and the rainfall pattern. Last year, never ever heard before that the Ganges water has gone down so low. The National Thermal Power Corporation in Farakka had to stop power generation for a few days because there was not enough water in the river. So that's the kind of situation. So rainfall is there, but as we know, it's becoming skewed and all. So how you see the kind of changing climate impacting groundwater broadly, Professor Matin?
As for the predictions made so far, so there will be more rainfall, but within a shorter period.
Yes.
So that would have impact both ways. We will have more drought and more flood. So and the recharge to groundwater will decrease. So this is the most, I think, as a groundwater specialist, this is where we need to focus more. And then what Aditi said earlier, that we have to think more about rainwater harvesting when it is available. We have to work on managed aquifer recharge and all these things, because this is something very important. Like current, if the current recharge scenario changes, then our groundwater is depleting because of our obstruction, and it's not everywhere. But if the rainfall pattern changes, then we'll have problem of depletion in many other areas.
Okay. Very quickly taking the others through. Let Professor Javed to come up to that. Climate change?
Yeah, let me start by saying this. Pakistan has been consistently ranked 7th vulnerable country that is likely to be affected by the effect of climate change. Why 7th vulnerable country? Just because of water resources, because we have large reserves of ice in Himalayas. And our 40% population is directly dependent on the meltwater that is coming from that Himalayas. And secondly, we have a large coastline. So if we have, what climate change is doing actually, we have less snowfall, we have less snow, we have less snow melting over there. So we have low river flows. So once we have low river flows, our concentration of contaminants will be increased in the groundwater. Okay. Just like the Indus Delta, if we have a low river flow, like for example, in the river Indus, so what will happen? The seawater will intrude into the groundwater. That can really badly affect the quality of water.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very quickly to Professor Polya, you would like to add anything on the climate change part of it?
It's not particularly my area, but one thing I would say is one of the consequences of climate change will be in the nature of rainfall, about how intense it is. So for those that were, for example, impacted by the floods in Chennai a few years ago, that is the kind of thing that people are predicting. Much more intense rainfall, surface runoff, and less infiltration into groundwater, recharging groundwater.
Abhijit, I know that you've been working in Sundarban's area on certain climate change related issues. Any input on that? How the climate change can play around with the groundwater in coming years or so?
Yes, absolutely. So as you have noted, like the extreme climates are intensifying in the coastal areas, and Sundarban is one of the victims of that. Globally, almost like out of the Indian Ocean cyclones or extreme climates, almost 70% of them hit the Sundarbans, either on the Indian side or the Bangladeshi side. So the coastal population in Bangladesh and India are possibly, absolutely much more vulnerable than any other parts of the country, because they have the extreme climate coming in and hitting them. Mm-hmm. They have the groundwater salination happening, and sometimes they also have the arsenic problem, in addition to the other socio-political issues. So in sense of climate change, the coastal areas of the South Asia, we are possibly, sitting at the top of the, the food chain in terms of climate change vulnerability. Okay. Because major parts of West Bengal and Bangladesh might vanish if there is, few centimeters of increase of sea level.
So I think that the relationship between climate change and, I understand, the groundwater needs to be probed at maybe at much, much greater depth, because it's something which is a bit of a new on the agenda, but it needs to be worked on pretty. Aditi, you spoke about the kind of impact of climate change a bit. Anything you would like to add on that, what you were saying on climate change impact?
Yes, certainly. I think the point about glaciers is super important because they are so important to the base flow. And as I said, their Indus is kind of much more vulnerable compared to Ganges and Brahmaputra, where the percentage of glacier contribution is lower. But even on groundwater, I understand, and this is a part of the IPCC assessment that we are involved in. If you remember, in the last IPCC AR5 cycle, IPCC came back saying that groundwater was one of the more resilient to climate change because of the, the slow movement, basically, compared to surface water. The reaction time of groundwater is much slower. And there are some interesting studies coming out both from the US as well as India saying that actually quite counterintuitively that in drier places, there could be more episodic kind of recharge with these high rainfall events. And on the other hand, we have also evidence saying that recharge might decrease. So I think that question is far from settled. And that's one area where we have to do much more inquiry, because of course, groundwater provides a kind of resilience because of its slow reaction time that somehow surface water would not. So we have to, I'm just underlying the importance of groundwater as a resilience to climate change.
Okay. We need to I'll come to the policy now, and I'll come to Aditi later, but let me start with Pakistan. We have heard about, we have discussed a policy a bit in tangential way, but directly, does Pakistan government has any clear policy on groundwater? And you see any improvement over the last few years? That's my common question to all the panelists. Let's start with Pakistan and be very brief, because I would like to talk solution for about 5 minutes.
Yes, there are policies. There is a clear water policy which covers both surface and groundwater. And from last few years, the policy has two main focus: management of available water and development of water resources, for example. So they have taken a massive steps. Like, for example, I will just quote lining of water courses. Lining of water courses is the major step, and it has carried out throughout the Pakistan. There are large projects in that.
Okay.
So this is the policy thing.
Okay. Let me kind of bit of an interrupt you because the time is running out. Just a quick supplementary question. As a researcher, as a scientist, are you happy with you were talking about the policy, but what about the practice and level of implementation? Are you happy with that?
No, it needs a lot of improvement. We need to educate our farmer, because once our farmer get educated, then we can save a lot of water using groundwater and all those things. Because there's a misconception about the lay public that groundwater is of good quality and surface water is not of good quality. People prefer to use the groundwater, and there is also one misconception that
the communication issue is a big one. Okay, fine. Professor Matin, very quickly, government of Bangladesh, are you happy with the policy? And if the policy you are happy with, are you equally happy with the practice and implementation? Professor Matin.
Currently, I am happy with none of those, because clear policy on groundwater is lacking. Like, India has better structure for groundwater management than any other countries in the subcontinent, on paper at least. You have the Central Groundwater Board, you have the Central Groundwater Authority. We don't have any single organization in Bangladesh to look after groundwater. And groundwater is always
let me assure you that
let
me assure you we have wonderful offices, beautiful buildings, not necessarily the equally beautiful implementation.
And also there is no control on groundwater abstraction. So this practice is you can abstract as much as you like. So that's we are working on that now. Like we are talking a lot about bringing more legal instruments for better managing groundwater. This is what we are working on now, but we are not there yet.
Okay. Abhijit, India is the elephant in the room. What's your take on that? Very quickly. Well, do the scientists like you being taken seriously when the kind of groundwater policy is being made or being... I'm taking out the execution part of it. Even
to my experience, the policy, at least in India, they are drafted by policymakers. I mean, not policymakers as bureaucrats, like bureaucrats and possibly engineers. So scientists are not really involved in the policy decisions or making the policies. So that's something that is very much lacking, even at the very top level. And at the ground level, you have to understand one thing, like we're always talking about the agriculture farmers are taking out the water. Now, why are they taking out the water? That's something also we need to understand. Because in South Asia, the irrigation practices that we are doing, we are still following what our predecessors used to do in Indus Valley time, right? We have not really, modernized ourselves. The same rice can possibly be sowed with 1/20th of the water that is being used as a flood irrigation. So if we can modernize and, with the interventions of AI and all other tools that we're getting, I think there is a huge scope of scientists to influence the policy.
Absolutely. Aditi.
Very briefly, I would even say that to try to control groundwater through groundwater laws is kind of knocking on the wrong door. We have to look at the drivers of groundwater overexploitation and we have to go to the source of the problem. So I would rather tinker with India's food policy. I would rather tinker with India's electricity policy than directly with groundwater. All the groundwater policies are command and control policies, ask farmers to get permits. Permits requires rent seeking or,
But Aditi, don't you think that if we kind of try to take it such a macro level and kind of the socio-geopolitics that operates in a country like India, it will become impossible to execute at some point of time because it becomes too big to, you see, one set of farmers' law, I'm not saying the right or wrong of it, and government also almost kind of accept that the laws are in the back burner. So you can even understand that if you make it too big, linking electricity policy, linking food policy, it becomes too big to be handled. Don't you think so?
But then I don't see of any other solution.
Way out.
I don't see any other way out. Like asking farmers to take a permit is actually giving a lot of power to the hand of groundwater officials who would always abuse that power.
Okay.
I would rather see, and you're coming to solution, maybe I'll just save you a couple of minutes and come up with some of the solutions right away. I would say that India needs to move towards a more nutritious food future, and they're incentivizing growing low water consuming crops like
the crop orientation.
Yes, crop orientation. So that's why I'm saying food policy and electricity. So we have to grow less water consuming crops like coarse cereals, millet, sorghum, which have low water requirement, but also more nutritious. We also have a diabetes problem. We have a micronutrition problem. We have multiple problems. So
So you see that it may be a bigger problem, bigger issue, but unless you link those up, unless you link those dots, you are not going to get a sustainable solution. That's your take it. Let's very quickly take from Professor Polya. Professor, from outside, what do you think that in South Asia, only policies, no practices?
I think that's key issue. I mean, one thing I would say as a scientist, I personally don't think that scientists should make policy. I think policy is a socio-political kind of process. We should inform it, scientists should inform it, and very importantly, social scientists and economists should inform it as well. Personally, I think the three key areas that should help drive this, they're not specific solutions, but one is in transparency of information and data is absolutely vital. The second one, as you say, Jayanta, and has been referred to elsewhere, is in implementation, actually get it done.
Exactly.
Monitoring is vital in that. And the third one is education, particularly of a huge mass of people. And I would say, if you wanted to focus on a particular group, it's education of women in poor rural communities that will drive an increase in productive behaviors.
But one word, are you happy with the practice of, are you happy with the kind of what has been happening in the policy, the practice of the policies in South Asia? You think that they're doing enough, or you think there is scope for improvement, a lot of improvement? I would say a lot of improvement.
I'm not the best person to answer that question,
okay,
but I think everywhere
let that be spill over. Let that be spill over.
Improvement is possible.
I have 2-3 minutes time. Let me start with Professor Javed. Last 1 hour or so, we have discussed various facets of groundwater, its problems, the sources of problems, climate change, policy. Or a natural resource that cuts across the countries. India's groundwater doesn't limit in India's border. It goes over to Bangladesh, to Pakistan. Also, the rivers are likewise. Don't you see the... Do you think that it's a wishful thinking, or it's possible?
I don't know whether it's possible or not, but as a scientist, I think many of my friends and closest colleagues are not from my own country. They're across the world. The people that are on this call, I think that's one of the bases of having good solutions to these problems is working together.
Okay. Aditi, your take?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, science should know no boundaries, and there is all the need for cooperation. So very briefly, I wanted to talk about, for instance, it is indeed possible perhaps to incentivize farmers to pump less groundwater. And we currently have a project that's working in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Nepal on solar irrigation pumps, where we are trying to incentivize farmers to sell the electricity back to the grid instead of pumping groundwater, by incentivizing farmers. So actually they can earn some revenue from, selling electricity.
So we can learn and unlearn from each other.
Yes, absolutely.
We can learn and unlearn from each other.
There's a huge lessons. I mean, I always look up to
Bangladesh
for us. Yes.
There are case studies.
And I look up to Bangladesh for the way they have treated arsenic both in agriculture and drinking water. So I feel there's a lot of interlearning, learning that we can do from each other.
Abhijit, final word.
Yeah.
Is it possible? Is it wishful thinking? It's just a mirage? What do you think?
No, I think like in the last 20 years with the digital innovation and increase of connectivity, this is very much possible. For example, like Professor Matin, Ahmed, and I have been co-supervising students.
Absolutely.
And so I'm doing with my Pakistani colleagues. So I think it's very much possible, even if not at the government level, but at the human level and the researcher level.
Okay. I think a great discussion over the last 1 hour or so. There are a lot of agendas, a lot of issues have come up. Two things are sticking with me. One is that the last point that all of you have agreed that there is really a scope for if not the geopolitics, but at least the experts like you, maybe also media, maybe other platforms, to work together on these critical agendas of natural resources which go beyond border. They don't get limited to the borders. So it's extremely important to probe that option. That's number one. But the one point that Abhijit mentioned, and also I think Aditi kind of supplemented, the rivers like Indus and Ganges are in trouble, are in real trouble. And if we can jolly well imagine what if Indus and Ganges even significantly get problematic, what is the future of South Asia? So the South Asian future rests on this kind of rivers and water resources. And as we already have known that groundwater and river and surface waters are in tangent. They don't work isolatedly, they're in tandem. So I think great discussion. Vanishing groundwater, yes, the question mark is no longer there, it's vanishing. But at the same time, as Aditi pointed out, that we need to take water, quote unquote, together, not cut out the surface water, groundwater, subsurface water. And also we need to talk together, all these countries, at least the experts like you. Another time, another day. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bye. Bye.
ਫਤਿਹਗੜ੍ਹ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਦੀ ਗਿਣਤੀ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਛੋਟੇ ਜ਼ਿਲ੍ਹਿਆਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੀਤੀ ਜਾਂਦੀ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਅਨਾਜ ਉਤਪਾਦਨ ਦੇ ਮਾਮਲੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹ